You know, John, I try not to ask too much of our audience, but...
But? There's always a but.
Yeah, remember people tell you that if somebody says to you, you look great, but don't believe anything before but.
There you go.
But you can believe this, my friends, if you listen and you come back time and again because you love the topics, the approach, looking forward at social and political issues. Could you do us a solid? What do you think this is, John, that I'm asking?
I think you're asking for them to, wherever they listen, to give us a good review.
Ah, yes, John. 5 stars.
Which is important. Which is important.
Yeah, that's all we're looking for, is the highest review you can possibly give for a podcast that you come back to time and again. Is that too much to ask, John?
No, I think that's a nice thing to do.
So whether it's Apple or Google or Spotify or TuneIn Radio, wherever it is that you're listening, please, if you could, give us a great review, because that will help us and it will position us in the constellation of so many podcasts in such a way that you and others can find us more easily.
Yeah, we'll be right up front where you can find us. You don't have to go hunting.
Absolutely.
Searching.
And don't forget to check out the MHNR network. And we're right there because we've joined this new network and we're thrilled to be a part of it. Again, MHNRnetwork.com.
And if you click on where it says shows, I think we're the second or third one down, America Trends.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And remember, 5 stars.
What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik. And John, remember the South American country where someone said, well, what's the leading sport in South America? And somebody said, oh, it's bullfighting. He goes, oh, that's revolting. He said, no, that's number 2.
All right, I get it.
You get that one?
Get it.
Well, I've got to tell you, in this new book by John Judis, The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. Now, this is taking place all across the world. It's not a phenomenon only left to the United States, though in many ways, America, we wall ourselves off, and we think that if it's going on here, then we must have started it.
Right, but I know the French are in the middle of craziness about the globalization and about the taxation. It's stuff we don't hear about, in other countries.
Oh, absolutely. But this John Judis, who we have, he predicted a lot of this way back in a book that he called The Populist Explosion, right around the time of the 2016 election. And now he wanted to follow on to that in 2018-19, looking again at what he predicted and what it's meant in terms of governance in countries like ours and others.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting to look at that, because I'm sure there's a lot of countries out there that are really upset with what's going on and are, more than our country, are revolting actually against it. And, I don't know why us Americans are so sleepy.
I don't know, but, we really have to recognize that not every element of being proud of your country or wanting to make certain that certain unique qualities of it are preserved. He's reminding us that we need to reclaim, in his mind, what's valid in these movements while recognizing that it's in a country's national interest to have strong international institutions. So he's got a very nuanced look at all of this, and we can have both. We really can. We can still be proud to be Americans, but still be really responsible players on the international scene.
Yeah, I think we got to figure this out, though, how it all works, how it all comes together. We get these bad trade deals, and we get, I don't know if a lot of the nationalization has really worked out for us in our favor because of greed.
Well, he's also trying to remind us, and many who might be more moderate to liberal, that in fact, don't just dismiss what's been going on here. We have to understand it, and we have to know how to kind of calibrate it so that it works for the American experiment. And don't forget, we're a very young nation in many ways, and we still have a lot of growing pains, and we're still trying to figure out what this experiment means, even well into this new century of ours. With us today on America Trends is John Judis, and he's got a new book out, The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. And John, you've been looking at this issue for a very long time. You wrote The Populist Explosion, and you predicted that there would be this worldwide wave of populist sentiment on the left and the right in reaction to globalization. But how far has this movement come over the years that you've been studying it?
Well, I've actually been studying it for longer than 2 or 3 years. I wrote a manifesto about the new nationalism in 1995. And, we had a political candidate in the United States, Ross Perot, in 1992,
of course,
who ran on this idea of made in the USA. So it's not new to us or new to me, but in this last decade, we've seen a upsurge in populist politics on both the right and the left. And I'd say as of today, more on the right than the left. Particularly, if you look at Donald Trump in the United States, and then you look in Europe, where parties like the Alternative for Deutschland, they used to be called the National Front, now it's called the National Rally in France, the Sweden Democrats, all these right-wing populist parties are on the upsurge and really reshuffling the deck politically in Europe, just as Trump is doing in the United States.
Well, when you looked at perhaps the emerging majority many years ago with a co-author, you thought the Democrats might pick up this mantle of economic populism. Have they dropped it?
No, they haven't dropped it. The Bernie Sanders campaign was very much along those lines, and I think you'll see candidates in the 2020. Right now you could mention Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, who are going to take up those kind of issues. So, no, they haven't dropped it, but to some extent, they dropped the ball in 2008 when Obama was elected. We had a major crisis. Democrats had majorities in both the House and the Senate, and they really let the Republicans and the Tea Party capture the kind of anti-Wall Street sentiment that was very widespread in the country, and that might have led the Democrats to maintaining that majority after 2008.
Yeah, how much of that comes out of the financial crisis? I just watched a documentary, and this was, I think, the first one where Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson really spoke looking back upon that crisis. And Barack Obama, I guess, had a decision to make as to who would become his economic advisors at the time. Would they be people who were outside of the establishment? And, of course, he went for Tim Geithner and Larry Summers. Was that a defining moment for Barack Obama and the Democrats?
I think it was really important because what it meant was that he was bringing people into his administration who would be concerned above all about business confidence. They wouldn't want to do anything to upset major corporations or Wall Street, and who were not attuned to what the consequences politically were going to be of, for instance, not going after Wall Street people who had done illegal things in that first year, 2009. And the result was that there was a Republican wave in the 2010 election, and then again in 2014. 14, and they captured all these state legislatures. So it also meant that that after 2010, the administration was hampered in doing anything about the recession, which went on probably a good bit longer than it should have done because of government spending being held down by the Republicans.
When we look at these terms, populism, vis-a-vis nationalism, even nativism, how do we define these terms, and are they really different in different cultures, different political cultures across the globe?
Well, yeah, the first thing to say is that there is no definition of them. If you mean by a definition a set of characteristics that exclusively define everybody who's called a populist and nobody else. In the United States, a Republican who cares at all about the poor or about the workers is called a populist. Jack Kemp, the late congressman, was called a populist. Reagan was sometimes called a populist. Putin is called a populist. So it doesn't. Again, I think what you have to talk about, if you talk about any of these terms, is a certain political tradition, and you have to hope that there's a common understanding between you and the people you're talking about what that tradition is. But it's not science. There is no special definition that you can plug into formulas of populism or nationalism.
Well, our president recently identified himself as a nationalist. And of course, what he has done is point the finger at globalization, saying that, in fact, we have shipped too many jobs overseas. He's looked at immigration and said somebody is tamping down your wages because of low, wage labor that's coming across. And of course, he has helped to stir up various cultural resentments. Is that the way you would look at nationalism in America, the way it's practiced today?
Well, it's certainly the way that Trump practices nationalism. But I guess what I do is I'd say that there's a basic kind of nationalism which you can think about as national identity, seeing yourself as an American. Somebody from France seeing themselves as a Frenchman or a Frenchwoman. That is essential to democracy, for instance, because to be part of a democracy, you have to accept the idea that people you've never seen and you never are going to see have an equal say in who's going to be elected in the country or in your state or in your city. To have a welfare state, for me to pay taxes. For somebody, a handicapped person in Reno, Nevada, that I'll never see, I have to believe that that person is entitled to it because he or she is also an American, just like me. So that basic sense of national identity is important, and if you start denying it, then you get into trouble. Beyond that, you get a kind of explicit nationalist politics that pops up at certain times, where a politician or a party or a movement says that we are acting on behalf of the nation against people who want to do harm to the nation. Now that too can be left-wing, right-wing, centrist. Abraham Lincoln was a nationalist, for instance. Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, also Hitler, Mussolini. Trump, I think, belongs to the right-wing side of it, where the people that he's scapegoating, the people that he is saying are a danger to the country, again, are legal immigrants, people like that, whose danger to the country he's wildly exaggerating. That they're murderers and rapists are pouring into the country and so on. So I think with Trump you get a more right-wing version of it. But as far as nationalism, national identity is concerned, that's really an essential part of who we are, and it's an important part that if it starts to erode, if we start to think, well, half the country aren't really Americans or Spanish or what have you, it's going to be very hard to have a democracy and a welfare state.
How different is nationalism in a place like America, where basically what we congeal around is an idea of equality and fairness and, one person, one vote, and everyone innocent until proven guilty, and all the precepts of our American Constitution and Declaration of Independence, as opposed to a France or Spain, where they have more of an ethnic identity. How different is it coming from America?
Well, I think it's not as different as some people would say. I don't think when you think of yourself as an American, what leaps to mind first, unless you're, running a podcast or a political campaign, is the Declaration of Independence. You might think about the flag, Thanksgiving, the national anthem, what have you. But being an American still is a kind of cultural assumption. That there are a lot of people who are like you, and they can be like you in funny kinds of ways. We had a big battle over nationalism and nationality from about 1880 to 1920, when there were a lot of immigrants coming into the country. And believe it or not, at that time, Italians, Jews, they weren't even seen as white people. They were seen as something else. That changes completely during the period of World War II and afterwards. So there is a kind of common sense of a common conception of who we all are, and we're brought up on it as children. We go to parades, we have holidays, monuments, things like that. So I think that there's a lot of unconscious assumptions that are built into it that can't be defined by, let's say, we think everybody, we know what Article 4 of the Constitution is, or something like that. So I think you have to think of it psychologically as well as ideologically, or Germany. And when it breaks down again, let's take Britain with Scottish independence and things like that. That's when you get into a problem. And in those cases, or the Catalans in Spain, it's not a case of people saying, well, we don't believe in X, Y, Z, but somehow, we have a different heritage. We were brought up differently. We are different people. So it's a more complicated cultural and psychological fact.
Okay, so let's assume that the whole melting pot conception of the American nation is a relatively new one, and we looked at the other as being a problem for many, many years of our existence. Having said that, I think we have been moving toward, both legally and, in terms of rights and identity, something that looks at everyone in a way and says, whether you're black, white, you're this, you're that, you're an American. And yet we seem to be pulling away from each other. And some of this cultural difference that we're talking about, where certain people really love to salute the flag and others think, well, that's rather quaint. And you define it, I think, and others have, as those who live perhaps in the urban areas in America versus those who live in more rural areas. And it's defined at times as somewheres versus anywheres. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, again, I think that, for 99% of Americans, again, we're nationalists. When the country's attacked, we want to defend it. But there's a difference among us about how important nationality and being an American is. And that sometimes infects our political debate, for instance, over the Colin Kaepernick kneeling in the national anthem. And some of the difference comes from the fact that if you look at a lot of, it's not so much rural. A lot of rural America is doing okay, especially in the farm countries. But small town, mid-sized town America, Muncie, probably where you're calling from, somewhere in Connecticut, Hartford.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Erie, Pennsylvania. Akron, Ohio, towns that were once very prosperous during the manufacturing era, that had a lot of, let's say insurance companies headquartered there that have now moved out, become kind of like ghost towns. And the people left there, primarily older, feel that a lot of their way of life was taken from them. They used to have jobs where you could expect lifetime employment. Used to belong to unions. There used to be, bars on the corner that everybody would go to. Churches that everybody would attend. And a lot of that kind of life, that common life, has been eroded over the last 50 years, maybe less than that, 30 years. And what that has produced is a much more of an emphasis on being an American and the importance of America, and the importance of making things and of having American goods in stores. Now, if you go to contrast that to somebody who lives where I do in the Washington, D.C. metro area, or in New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, areas also that are characterized by the new economy, digital economy, that are to a great extent are thriving, and where you have a lot of college-educated people who have multiple identities. They feel they can go live anywhere they want. I mean, they could go live and be comfortable in other cities and even in other countries. They think of themselves, if you live in Washington, I learned this when I moved here in 1982, after about 5 minutes, when you meet some big shot downtown, they'll tell you what college they graduated from, especially if it was Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. And you might even hear what prep school they went to, because that's an important part of their identity. You'll learn about who they know, what important people they know. So there's a kind of sense of multiple identities that people have. Again, you could see it in terms of cosmopolitanism versus nationalism that you find in these new big urban centers, and you find it overseas in London versus the smaller towns to the northeast that used to be centers of manufacturing. You find it in Paris versus the north, and that becomes a focus of the battle over America first, France first, England first, where, for instance, immigrants become a threat, and the idea of an alien culture being brought in. I mean, we have enough problems, with our whole communities falling apart. Now we have all these signs in Spanish, and people speak strange languages in the grocery stores and so on. So I think, again, a lot of the conflict arises on this economic basis of the different things that have happened to this country in let's say, the Midwest, and in versus someplace like Washington, D.C., New York, Boston.
John Judis is with us. The new book is called The Nationalist Revival. And John, let's go back even 15 or 20 years, and we were told that the world was shrinking and that we were all in it together, that we had interdependent economies, that we had to worry about the global climate because it would affect all of us in different ways. And yet now we see this pulling apart. What went wrong with globalization? How has it failed, or at least failed to convince people that we're all in it together?
Well, I think to some extent there was overreach in the 1990s that was fueled by the end of the Cold War and the feeling that we had won the Cold War. We also had that tremendous burst of prosperity from about 1995 through 2001, where people felt there was never going to be a recession anymore, that we had embarked upon. Again, that's when the term new economy comes up. So, it was during that time that we took various steps that reflected a kind of optimism that the whole world was going to become like us, and that that world would be prosperous indefinitely. When we were part of the World Trade Organization, we invited China in under the idea that China would become like us. It would become more of a liberal democratic country. We wouldn't have trade conflicts with them. We expanded NATO from the west to the east up to the edge of the old Soviet Union, with the idea that the Russians were going to become like us and they wouldn't become fearful and nationalistic and hostile. So we conducted ourselves under these kinds of assumptions, and it hasn't worked out. In terms of the climate controversy that you mentioned, that's always been kind of a problem. I mean, we went to Kyoto in 1999 and signed a treaty, and then when the American delegation came back and wanted it ratified in the Senate, I think the vote was 99 to nothing or something like that against. So that's always been a problem because of the fears about the what it would do for the economy, and it's lamentable because there are certain problems in the world that can only be solved internationally. We can't do it just by ourselves. That's one of them, but the resistance to that goes back to the 1990s. That's never been really an accepted popular policy in the United States. It's always been in contention.
Now, you urge leaders to do something that I think is quite difficult in a way, that we need to identify, reclaim what is valid as it relates to nationalism, while at the same time recognizing that it may be in our country's national interest, that's nationalism in a sense, to have strong international institutions. How do we marry those two thoughts?
Oh, I don't know. The world might just fall apart. It's very, very hard, and I think that you get that kind of thing happening either when there's unbroken prosperity and people are willing to take chances, or when there's such a crisis that people come together because they think they have to do something. Now, in the past, what's happened is we've had world wars, and we had 2 world wars in a row. Millions of people got killed, and out of that came all these international institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on. So, but we don't want to go through that again, and with nuclear weapons, the planet can't afford to do it. So it's a big problem how we are going to finally get ourselves to the point where we do tackle something like climate change, and it might take a crisis, and it might be 20 or 30 years from now.
You suggest that the Nationalist Revival is a reaction to a failure of these global initiatives that sailed over the heads, you wrote in a piece in the New York Times, of ordinary citizens. So was it not sold properly, or was it really only to benefit, say, multinational corporations to send jobs overseas? So was it bad policy or bad communication about what these initiatives were meant to do?
Oh, I think it was a combination of the two. I think that at least a good many people in Washington really believed that by bringing China into the World Trade Organization, we were going to increase we were going to have a trade surplus, not a trade deficit with them, and that it wouldn't hurt American manufacturing jobs. As a result, estimates are 2.5 million jobs we lost. So, it wasn't sold correctly in the sense that people didn't understand what the real impact was, and people who did understand it were denounced. I mean, they were seen as protectionists, what have you, in Washington. So, yes. And should we have done it a little differently? Yes, I think that's true, too. I think we should have proceeded much more cautiously. Same thing with NATO.
You also suggest that the decline of the liberal parties or social democratic parties is a result, at least in part, of their inability to distinguish what is legitimate and justifiable in nationalism from what is small-minded, bigoted, and contrary to the national interest. How do you see that playing out today in America?
Well, again, I would go back to the earlier book, the populism book, and say that the main problem that Democrats and particularly the left, socialist, labor, social democratic parties in Europe have had is that faced with the Great Recession, they didn't go fast enough and far enough, and in the case of Europe, joined the more conservative business parties in adopting positions of austerity. So they made things worse, especially for the working classes. And as a result, some of the parties, like the Socialist Party in Greece, virtually disappeared. Doesn't exist anymore. The Socialist Party in France is just about gone. They're 5% in the polls. So I think that was the key problem in the United States, and I think that to some extent we faced this in 2016. There is an unwillingness on the part of Democrats and liberals to recognize that there are that we do have borders, that they need to be enforced. That while we need to bring the people who were here illegally or undocumented into the country and into our fold and give them a path of citizenship, we also have to make sure that we have a immigration policy that reflects our laws and that reflects our national interest. And I think that there's not enough emphasis on that among Democrats and liberals, and that's left an opening for for Trump and the Republicans who want to say that it's all murderers and rapists and terrorists who are entering the country.
Do you think that whoever can occupy what has been the default position in American politics, the center, and can occupy it with some interesting policies that begin to adhere some of the fissures in our political culture, are they the ones who will occupy a lot of the positions of power going forward? Do we have to get back to the center?
Well, I don't know what the center is with Donald Trump. I mean, his character and personality so dominate our politics right now, and I think that he was the major issue in 2018, and could well be again in 2020. And that's not to his advantage or the country's, because it'll put off the question of what kind of policies we really need. I think that there's a lot of disappointment with Trump, not among, again, he has an active base of support of, let's say, 20 or 25% of the electorate, but for a lot of Americans, we expect our presidents not only to be prime ministers but also kings. This goes back to the founding of the country. They're the head of state as well as the chief politician, and Trump has been this enormous disappointment to people. And so I think that's going to be still the big issue in 2020 if he runs again. And there are a host of policies that the Democrats are going to put forth, and that the Republicans will. But we're going to have to see after 2020 what's viable among them and what can actually be done.
In closing, I mean, there were a lot of things that people liked about what he said, or aspirations that they invested in him in 2016 in terms of taking a system that was in disrepair as it relates to its balance with a nationalist agenda, if you will, or helping people feel more comforted about their economic futures. What are the norms that he has disturbed past a point where a lot of people just say, yeah, we wanted some change, but we didn't want this kind of change?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do not even with policy, but with behavior, with the lying in the White House, the tweets, all that stuff, the lack of dignity. That's the, I mean, and the boasting, the narcissism, all that stuff. It's not what Americans or most Americans expect of their presidents. And I think, again, if it weren't for that, with 3% unemployment in 2018, I think the Republicans would have had a pretty good time at the polls and not have suffered the kind of defeats they did. I mean, there was a factor of what they did in the House with the Affordable Care Act. I think that was an issue outside of Washington, and it was an important issue for a lot of people who feared that the Republicans were going to take away their health care. But still, with that kind of unemployment and prosperity in the country, you don't expect a party to lose 40 seats.
John Judis, thank you so much for being with us today on America Trends. The book is called The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. Thanks again.
Sure, my pleasure.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah, what's up,
I
John?
got some exciting news for you.
Well, let's hear it.
We're part of the MHNR network.
And where can we find that?
That's MHNRnetwork.com.
I'm going there right now.
All right.